Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the AthElite podcast. My name is Ross from AthElite Strength and Conditioning, and we'll be talking about genetics and discussing the importance of genetics in athletic development. So to start off, what is genetics? Genetics refers to the genetic ceiling, if you like, in athletic development and athletic performance. So this word or this phrase genetics can be used interchangeably with potential. So we might be more familiar with commentators and other people in the sports science and the sports industries calling and using the word potential. So genetics is almost interchangeable with that term as well. Although this is the case, so this phrase or these two phrases can be misinterpreted for the other phrase called ability. So the difference between the two is ability is basically how good someone is at performing a skill or performing some kind of athletic task or athletic capability, whereas genetic or potential is basically how good they can be at performing that skill or how good they can be in that physical attribute. So to put it into context, so an example I like to use is relate athletes back to cars, and using these as an analogy might help you guys grasp a better understanding of what we mean by genetics. So we've got three different cars we're going to use as an example for today's podcast. We've got a Lamborghini, we've got a Ford Ranger, and we've also got a Toyota Camry. So if we would discuss genetics of athletes, so using Lamborghini, that would be like a fast twitch fiber athlete, very quick, very agile, good for short bursts, however lacks the strength or lacks the endurance of a Toyota Camry or lacks the strength, as we just touched on before, of a Ford Ranger. Speaking about the Ford Ranger, doesn't have the speed as the Lamborghini, however has a lot more strength than the Toyota Camry or the Lamborghini. It might have better endurance than the Lamborghini, however doesn't have the speed but definitely has a strength. And lastly, the Toyota Camry. So these kind of athletes would be your more slow twitch fiber, if you like, so your more endurance type of athletes. Doesn't quite have the strength as the Ford Ranger, might not be as quick as your Lamborghini, but can go all day. So putting these cars and athletes types into context, so your Lamborghinis are generally for team sports, your wingers, your halfbacks, your fullbacks, so that running really quick style of players. Your Ford Rangers are generally your ruckman or your goalkeepers or your centre halves in soccer and AFL. And lastly, your Toyota Camrys are generally your midfielders, so those guys might not have that explosive pace, but they can go all day with a great tank. So how does this relate to genetics? So if we use these cars as an example, so the actual car and the car make and the type of car, that, using this as an analogy, is your genetic makeup. So you might not be as quick as a Lamborghini, so the Toyota Camrys might not be as quick as your Lamborghinis. However, it's really about the driver as well. So whoever's driving the car, which technically that's your ability. So as we talked about before, your genetic makeup is your potential, how good you possibly can be at performing a skill, whereas ability is the driver in the car. So for example, you might be a Lamborghini, but the driver might not be using that Lamborghini much and might only go to 60 kilometers an hour. So really, your genetic makeup really means nothing. So you compare this to a Ford Ranger who might have less speed than a Lamborghini. However, using that speed, he might go to 100 kilometers an hour. So he's using more of his potential than the Lamborghini, and he can actually improve better than the Lamborghini because he has better coaches, better training techniques, works harder, works smarter, misses less training, probably less injured, purely because of correct training techniques. So in a nutshell, the make of the car is like the genetic makeup of athletes. So whether someone's a Lamborghini, Ford Ranger, or Toyota Camry, that is your genetic makeup. And your ability is the driver. So both are very important, but we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into how important is genetics in athletic performance. So in a nutshell, genetics does play a huge role in athletic development and athletic performance. Some numbers are insane. So there's been heaps of studies that show the heritability, or basically genetic impact that genetics does play in athletic performance is massive. So it generally ranges between 40 to 80%, and we will post something on Instagram and Facebook in the coming weeks about this. So for example, there was a study done in 1995, and they basically wanted to figure out how much of an impact does genetics play on muscle fiber type. And they found that around about 50% of your muscle fiber type is genetically inherited. So that's your heritability percentage there. In other studies, they also found VO2 max to be about 50% heritability. Lower body strength was found to be around about 60% heritability. In another study, balance was found to be around about 40%. Skill acquisition. So this one here is really interesting. So an athlete's ability to perform a skill, this is in another study, was found to be 70% genetically inherited, which that really shocked me, that number, because I always thought that a skill or the ability to perform a skill, such as kicking a ball or throwing a ball, was developed over time. But however, 70% of it is genetically inherited, which is quite a surprising number. So height, so someone's height is 80% genetically inherited, which is really not surprising. Simple formula: if you've got tall parents, you're more likely to be tall. But saying that, it's not. There is exceptions to the rules, and it's not always the case there. So athlete status is another one. So how good of an athlete someone is going to be. That's basically total strength conditioning and performance-wise. That's about 70% in another study they found. And lastly, mesomorphy, or someone to have a mesomorph body type. If anyone doesn't know what a mesomorph body type is, it's basically those really lean athletes, generally fast twitch fiber athletes, and they have low body fat percentage, high muscle mass percentage, and a lot of fast twitch fiber type 2A they have, so they are able to adapt quite heavily between your endurance events and your speed events and sprinting events, and 80% heritability percentage, which is also quite significant in having that type of body type. So as we just discussed previously, so all these take into account about 40 to 80% heritability in someone's strength conditioning and skill acquisition and other physical attributes, which is quite significant. So putting this into context, so how do you identify what type of athlete you are? So using the car example again, so we'll use a Lamborghini for example. So if you're a Lamborghini type of athlete, you would identify your strengths and your weaknesses first. And from this, generally Lamborghinis are very fast twitch fibers athletes, and they're very quick and agile. So they're your two strengths. What are your weaknesses? Generally it's endurance, and generally it's sometimes can be strength depending on what size they are and etc. So that leads on to the next topic, body type. So you want to identify if you're ectomorph, mesomorph, or endomorph. So an ectomorph is someone who is tall, generally got long limbs, and generally leaner, low body fat percentages. However, they're more, generally speaking, your slow twitch fiber athletes. However, there are some exceptions to the rule. Your mesomorphs, so your mesomorphs, as we spoke about before, they're your leaner athletes with high muscle mass percentages, low body fat percentages, and endomorphs. So endomorphs are generally your shorter, stockier, they've got short limbs. Basically, in a nutshell, they look like powerlifters, really, really strong athletes. So generally, if we have to rank an order between the cars and body type, using them as examples, your endomorphs, So these are your strong athletes. They correlate more often than not with your forward rangers because both of them are strong athletes. Your mesomorphs generally correlate with your Lamborghinis, very fast twitch fiber athletes, explosive, powerful, and agile. And lastly, your ectomorphs. So these are kind of more of your slower twitch fiber athletes. And this probably correlates more with your Toyota Camrys with genetics. So other ways how you can identify what type of athlete, or if we're using the cars for an example, what type of car you are, is GPS data. So if anyone's ever wore GPS data in team sports such as AFL, soccer, hockey, rugby, generally by your GPS you can get a guide of what type of athlete you are. Obviously, if you're covering a lot of kilometers, but your top speed's not quite there, you're more likely to be a ectomorph or Toyota Camry, and vice versa. So if you're more of that sprint and repeated sprints, however, you're not performing a lot of kilometers, you're probably more likely to be that mesomorph or possibly an endomorph, and also that Lamborghini. A couple more ways you can identify what type of car or what type of body type you are is in the gym. So basically how much weight you're lifting, how many reps you can perform until fatigue, how much you're fatiguing during the session, how much you're fatiguing after the session. So generally, if you are those bigger, stronger guys, they're going to fatigue a lot quicker because they're lifting heavier weights than the guys that aren't lifting heavier weights, but they can perform more reps. So purely because they're probably more slower twitch fiber athletes, whereas the stronger guys, they're more fast twitch fiber athletes, which their fatigability isn't quite as good as your slower twitch fiber athletes. But there is a give and a take for everything. So obviously it's very rare you get athletes that are just good at everything. So you do have a fair bit of a give and a take. So generally strong athletes, high correlation between strong and fast. There's also a high correlation between your slower twitch fibers and those endurance athletes and weakness. However, you can develop everything. It's just a matter of identifying your strengths and weaknesses, training sports specifically, and working from there. And lastly, recovery. So how quick is someone recovering between games, between trainings, can also give you a bit of an indication of what type of athlete they are. So if they're recovering quite quick, they're more likely to be that slower twitch fiber athlete, so your Toyota Camry. If they're recovering quite slow, they could be that Ford Ranger or Lamborghini. And there's been studies that have shown that the reason why they can recover slower, and that's in the weights room, after games, after training sessions, it's a pretty simple formula. So they have seen some promising evidence into this, and it could be something as simple as performing tasks or sprints or weight training at higher intensities, where the slower twitch fiber athletes can't perform it at that intensity. That might have an impact on their fatigability. So it could be a combination of their fast twitch fiber and genetic makeup allowing them to perform a task at a higher level or higher intensity, which leads to fatiguing quicker. So using all of this previous information, how do you maximize your training to suit your needs? So as we spoke about before, you need to identify your strengths, your weaknesses, but also identify the demands that are specific to the sport and your position. So this is important because what's relevant to a midfielder isn't necessarily relevant to a full forward. What's relevant to a ruckman isn't necessarily related to a winger. So it's really important about specificity. We touched on that in our previous episode with Austin Stubbs about training specifically to your position and working on your own training rather than just your general consensus of training. It's also important to work on your needs specific to your position and your playing style. And this goes for individual sports as well. So there's different types of individual sports. So we'll use combat sports, for example. If you're a type of fighter, if in mixed martial arts, you want to work to your strengths, So you're going to have a different style to maybe your opponent. So you want to work on what you need to work on rather than working on what everyone else is working on, because everyone does differ. So it's really important to individualize your training. After this, you want to create some competitive goals so you can get the most out of your training and have targets which basically will help you track your progress. So I like to use objective targets rather than subjective, purely because objective, it's a number, have you reached it, yes or no? Whereas subjective is almost, it's left up to interpretation. Like how do you know if you're getting stronger with, when a coach says you're looking stronger? You don't really know unless you do specific strength testing, for example. So it's really important to test yourself objectively using numbers and data. But with these goals, just make sure that they are specific to your sport. And as the previous point we touched on, so specific to your sport and specific to your position or type of style of athlete you are. So everything's about being specific to you. And lastly, we've got to be mindful of the law of diminishing returns. So if you haven't heard of the term, so the law of diminishing returns relates to the better you are as an athlete. So when we first start, so when we just say we're playing soccer here, if we've never played soccer before, we're going to see massive increases in development. So we're going to basically skyrocket in improvement straight away. And as we get better, that'll start to plateau. And that's where we need to vary our training and making sure that we keep on improving, because that's where a lot of people get stuck. They plateau and they reach that law of diminishing returns because they get at a specific level. So they might reach a level where they're comfortable at, or they haven't had enough variation in their training and they kind of just plateau from there. So you need to vary up your training, and you also need to have that mental drive to keep pushing. So you don't want to ever reach that state where you're comfortable with what you've achieved. Once you do that, you will probably plateau because you probably won't train smart or hard. You might get lazy because you're comfortable. So training smart is pretty important, because you want to vary your training so you don't plateau, but also have that individual and mental drive so you can continue to increase and improve in your athletic performance. So a quick summary and a quick wrap up. Genetics plays a huge role in athletic performance. However, the driver, as we spoke about before, is crucial. So it's almost just as important as your genetic makeup. So your genetic makeup equates to about 40 to 80% of your physical athletic qualities, which is quite a significant amount. However, as we just spoke about, it's the driver and your ability to train smart and train hard that really drives these genetics. So really, genetics and potential, as we spoke about before, is just a term. Unless you work for that under correct guidance, it really doesn't mean a whole heap, because you can have you can probably have worse genetics than someone else if you like to use that term. However, if player A has less genetics like fast twitch fibers, for example, than player B, but they have all the best sprinting coaches and they train perfectly, they might overtake player A because he might be lazy. Although that's the case, maybe it might work the other way around. So player A, because his genetics are so good, he might always be better than player B, even if he doesn't train. So there is a fair bit of give and take. Generally in those instances, there's probably no endurance there, because endurance is something quite hard to just be naturally given. But it is important to both train and work on your strengths and weaknesses, and not just your weaknesses. It's also important to work on your strengths as well. There we have it, guys. Thanks for listening to episode 3 of the AthElite podcast. Feel free to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. That's at AthElite SC, so ATHELITESC, to keep you guys posted on all new episodes of the AthElite podcast and much more information.